The silence of the Wyoming prairie echoed the emptiness in Tessa Thompson's heart as she stared unseeing at the small wooden cross marking her father's grave. The spring of 1876 had promised new beginnings after their long journey west, but typhoid fever had claimed him just 3 weeks after they had arrived at the settlement of Clearwater Creek. The wind rustled through the tall grasses surrounding the small cemetery on the hillside overlooking the burgeoning town. Tessa's black mourning dress billowed around her slender frame as she knelt, her gloved fingers tracing the rough-hewn wood of the marker. No tears came anymore. She'd cried herself dry during the first terrible days of his illness, then during the funeral. And now there was nothing left but a hollow ache and a throat that refused to form words. Behind her, Martha Wilson, the widow who had taken Tessa in after her father's passing, sighed heavily. "Child, it's been nearly 3 weeks. I know your heart is broken, but you need to come back to the living. Your pa wouldn't want this." Tessa didn't respond. She hadn't spoken a word since the night her father died, when she'd whispered goodbye as his life slipped away. It wasn't that she chose not to speak, the words simply wouldn't come, trapped behind a wall of grief that had sealed her voice away. Martha patted her shoulder. "I'll leave you be for a spell, but don't linger too long. Storm's brewing." With heavy footsteps, the older woman made her way back down the hill toward town. Tessa remained, as still as the marker before her. She had no plans, no future. At 22, she was alone in a frontier town where she knew almost no one. Her father had been everything, her only family after her mother's death years ago, her protector, her compass. Without him, she was adrift. The first raindrops spattered against the dry earth as the storm clouds gathered. Still, Tessa didn't move. "Miss, you ought to get to shelter." The deep voice came from behind her, but she didn't turn. A moment later, a tall figure moved into her peripheral vision. He crouched down beside her, not too close, respecting her space. Storms coming in fast. Wyoming storms can turn dangerous quick. When she didn't respond, he settled into a sitting position next to her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "My name's Matthew Ingram. I run the cattle operation north of town." He paused, studying her profile. "I knew your father, if only briefly. He was a good man, spoke highly of you." The thunder rumbled closer, and the rain began to fall more steadily. Matthew removed his long duster coat and, with a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance, draped it around her shoulders. "I don't mean to intrude on your grieving," he said softly, "but I can't in good conscience leave you out here in this weather. I'll sit with you a while if that's all right." Tessa didn't acknowledge him, but she didn't move away either. The coat smelled of leather, horses, and prairie wind. It was warm from his body heat. The rain fell harder, but Matthew made no move to leave or to pressure her. He simply sat beside her, his hat pulled low, water streaming from its brim. After nearly 20 minutes, he spoke again, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I lost my mother when I was 16 and my pa 2 years after. I know something of grief, not the same as yours, but I understand that hollow feeling, like someone carved out everything inside you." Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Tessa flinched involuntarily. "That's too close," Matthew said firmly, rising to his feet. "Miss Thompson, I have to insist we seek shelter. Your father would want you safe." When she still didn't move, he hesitated, then carefully placed his hands on her shoulders. "I'm going to help you up now." His touch broke something in her stillness. Tessa allowed him to guide her to her feet, her limbs stiff from kneeling so long. Once standing, her legs trembled with weakness. Matthew steadied her with a strong arm around her waist. "My wagon's just down the hill. Can you walk?" Tessa managed a small nod, the first response she'd given anyone in weeks. They made their way down the muddy path, rain pelting them, the wind whipping her skirts around her ankles. Matthew kept his arm firmly around her, his tall frame partially shielding her from the storm's fury. His wagon was sheltered beneath a stand of cottonwoods at the base of the hill. He helped her climb onto the seat, then covered her with a wool blanket he retrieved from the back before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. I'll take you to Mrs. Wilson's, he said, turning the wagon toward town. The journey was short but rough on the rain-soaked roads. Tessa clutched the blanket around her shoulders, Matthew's coat still draped beneath it. When they pulled up outside Martha Wilson's boarding house, the older woman rushed out onto the covered porch. "Oh, thank heavens. I was about to send someone looking for her," Martha called over the rain. "Bring her in, Mr. Ingram." Once inside the warm parlor, Martha fussed over Tessa, helping her remove the wet coat and blanket. "You're soaked through, child. Upstairs with you now for dry clothes before you catch your death." She glanced at Matthew, who stood awkwardly by the door, water dripping from his clothes onto the wooden floor. "Thank you for bringing her back, Mr. Ingram." Matthew nodded, his eyes still on Tessa's pale face. "It was no trouble, madam." To Tessa he added, "Take care, Miss Thompson." As Martha led her toward the stairs, Tessa paused and looked back at the tall cowboy. She couldn't speak, but she managed the smallest inclination of her head acknowledgement and thanks in one subtle gesture. Matthew's weathered face softened, and he touched the brim of his hat in response before turning to go. "Wait," Martha said. "You're drenched yourself. At least have some hot coffee before heading back out." Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "That would be welcome, madam, thank you." Martha guided Tessa upstairs to change, then returned to prepare coffee. By the time Tessa came back down in dry clothes, her damp hair braided and hanging over one shoulder, Matthew was seated at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup. He stood when she entered, that instinctive politeness that marked him as more than just a rough cattleman. "Miss Thompson, feeling better?" She didn't answer, but took the chair Martha pulled out for her across from Matthew. The older woman placed a cup of coffee before her and patted her shoulder before busying herself at the stove. "Mr. Ingram has been telling me he knew your father," Martha said. "They met when your pa was looking to buy land." Matthew nodded, watching Tessa carefully. "He came out to my ranch to ask about cattle raising. Had big plans for that parcel he purchased east of town. Said he wanted to build something that would make you proud." Tessa's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. The land her father had purchased, 80 acres of promising grazing land, now belonged to her. She had no idea what to do with it. "I offered to help him get started," Matthew continued. "That offer still stands, Miss Thompson. Whatever you decide to do with the land, I'm willing to assist." Martha brought a plate of biscuits to the table. "That's kind of you, Mr. Ingram. Tessa hasn't made any decisions yet, though. Still early days." Matthew nodded. "Of course, no rush." He finished his coffee and stood. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Wilson. I should get back to my ranch before this storm worsens." At the door, he turned back to Tessa. "Miss Thompson, I ride into town most Saturdays. If you'd like to discuss your father's land or, well, anything at all, I'd be happy to call on you." Tessa looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His dark brown hair was damp and slightly curled from the rain, and his jawline was strong beneath several days' growth of beard. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling in his steady gaze. She couldn't speak, but she managed another small nod. A slight smile touched his lips. "Until Saturday, then." True to his word, Matthew appeared at the boarding house the following Saturday afternoon. Tessa was in the parlor, mending one of her dresses, when Martha showed him in. "Miss Thompson," he greeted, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes were clean, his hair neatly combed, and he'd shaved. "I hope I'm not intruding," Martha answered for her. "Not at all, Mr. Ingram. Tessa was just doing some sewing. Would you like some tea?" "Thank you, madam." He took a seat in the armchair across from Tessa's position on the sofa. Martha bustled out to prepare the tea, leaving them alone. An awkward silence fell. Tessa set aside her sewing and folded her hands in her lap, unsure what to do. "I rode by your father's land yesterday," Matthew finally said. "Spring grass is coming in nicely. It's good grazing land, just as he thought." Tessa nodded, grateful for the practical topic. Have you thought about what you might want to do with it? He asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. Well, there's no hurry. Land will wait. He paused. I brought something for you. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a small, worn book. Poetry, Byron, I thought. Well, when words fail us, sometimes others' words can help. He held it out, and after a moment, Tessa reached for it. Their fingers brushed as she took the book, and a slight flush colored her cheeks. My mother loved poetry, Matthew explained. She used to read it aloud on winter evenings. After she died, I found comfort in the familiar verses. Tessa opened the book, running her fingers gently over the pages. It was a thoughtful gift, one that suggested Matthew Ingram was more than just a rough cattle rancher. Martha returned with the tea tray, and the conversation turned to town matters and the spring weather. Throughout it all, Tessa remained silent, but she listened attentively, especially when Matthew spoke. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. If you'd like, Miss Thompson, I could show you your father's land next week. Might help you decide what to do with it. Tessa hesitated, then nodded her acceptance. Saturday, then, around noon, another nod. Matthew smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. I look forward to it. After he left, Martha watched Tessa with a knowing look. He's a good man, that Matthew Ingram. One of the most respected ranchers in the county, for all that he's only 30. Built that operation from almost nothing after his parents passed. Tessa returned to her sewing, but her mind remained on the tall cowboy and his kind eyes. The following Saturday dawned clear and mild. Martha helped Tessa dress in her one riding skirt, a practical dark blue garment her father had insisted she bring west. You look nice, dear, Martha said, fastening Tessa's hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. It's good to see you getting out. Your father would be pleased. When Matthew arrived with a wagon and a saddled horse tethered behind, Tessa was waiting on the porch. He smiled at the sight of her riding attire. You ride, Miss Thompson. When she nodded, he looked pleased. Would you prefer the wagon or the horse? I brought both, not knowing. Tessa glanced at the horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare, and moved toward it. She's a good mount, Matthew assured her, helping her up into the saddle. Steady and sweet-tempered, the ride to her father's land took nearly an hour. Matthew rode alongside, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local knowledge. Tessa listened, appreciating his effort to fill the silence without expecting responses. Her father's land was indeed beautiful rolling grassland with a small creek running through it, and a stand of cottonwoods providing natural shelter. The foundation of what would have been their house stood unfinished on a small rise overlooking the property. They dismounted by the creek, and Matthew spread a blanket on the grass for their lunch. He'd brought a simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples, which they shared in companionable silence. Your father chose well, Matthew said, gazing across the land. This is prime grazing territory. With the creek for water and those trees for shelter, it's ideal for cattle. Tessa looked around, trying to see it through her father's eyes, to understand the dream that had brought him and her so far from their Pennsylvania home. You could sell it, of course, Matthew continued. Land this good would fetch a fair price, enough for you to return east, if that's what you wanted. The thought of returning east held no appeal. There was nothing for her there, no family, no home. Yet the idea of staying and working this land alone seemed equally impossible. Or you could lease the grazing rights, Matthew suggested. Keep ownership but let others run cattle here. I'd be interested myself, actually. Tessa turned to look at him, questioning. I've been looking to expand, he explained. My herd's growing and I could use more grazing land. I'd pay fair market rate, of course. It was a practical solution, one that would give her income without requiring her to leave. Tessa found herself nodding slowly. We could draw up an agreement in town next week, if you like. Nothing permanent, try it for a year, see how it works out. She nodded again, more decisively. Matthew smiled. Good, that's settled then. He paused, then added more softly, I'm glad you're staying, Miss Thompson. There was something in his eyes that made her heart flutter strangely. It had been so long since she'd felt anything beyond grief that the sensation was almost startling. As they packed up to leave, Tessa paused by the unfinished foundation, running her hand along the rough stones. This would have been her home. Perhaps, in a way, it still could be. Over the next several weeks, Matthew became a regular visitor at Martha's boarding house. He would come on Saturday afternoons, sometimes with business matters to discuss regarding the land lease, but increasingly just to sit with Tessa in the parlor or on the porch. Martha, watching with approval, often found excuses to leave them alone together. "Young people need their privacy," she told her other boarders with a knowing smile. Though Tessa still didn't speak, she and Matthew developed their own form of communication. He learned to read her expressions, her nods and shakes of the head, the way her eyes conveyed what her voice could not. For her part, Tessa began to write short notes, which Matthew received with evident pleasure. "Your handwriting is beautiful," he told her one afternoon as he read her note about some wildflowers she'd seen on her morning walk. "Like you." The compliment brought a blush to her cheeks, and she looked away, but not before seeing the warmth in his eyes. As spring gave way to summer, Matthew often took Tessa riding on her father's land, now partially stocked with some of Matthew's younger cattle. He showed her the ways of ranching, explaining the cycle of the seasons, the care of the animals, the rhythm of life on the range. "My foreman, Tom, handles most of the day-to-day operations," Matthew told her as they sat beneath the cottonwoods one hot July afternoon. "But I still ride out with the men most days. There's nothing like watching the sunrise from horseback." Tessa smiled, picturing it. In her notebook she wrote, "I would like to see that sometime." Matthew read it and looked up, his expression serious. "You could, you know, any time." The invitation hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. That evening, as they rode back to town, a sudden summer storm broke over them. They took shelter in an abandoned line shack, leading the horses inside out of the deluge. The small, one-room structure was dusty but sound, with a stone fireplace and a narrow cot against one wall. Matthew quickly got a fire going with the dry wood stacked beside the hearth. "We should wait it out," he said, glancing out the single window at the sheets of rain. "These storms usually pass quickly." Tessa nodded, removing her damp hat and moving closer to the fire. Her riding skirt was soaked at the hem, and she held it toward the flames to dry. Matthew watched her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You look like you belong out here," he said softly. "Like you were made for this life." She looked up at him, surprised. "I mean it," he continued. "Some folks never adjust to the frontier. They're always looking back east, missing what they left behind, but you've taken to it despite everything." Tessa reached for her notebook, which she now carried everywhere, and wrote, "I feel at home here, strangely enough, more than I ever did in Pennsylvania." "That's how it was for me," Matthew said. "My parents brought me here when I was 12. By 15, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else." He paused, adding more softly, "Now I can't imagine this place without you in it." Her heart hammered in her chest as she wrote, "I don't want to leave." "Then don't," he said simply. The rain drummed on the roof, and the fire crackled in the hearth, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy. Matthew moved to sit beside her on the rough wooden floor. "Tessa," he said, the first time he'd used her given name. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I care for you very much." She looked at him, her eyes wide. "You don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I just wanted you to know, whatever you decide to do about the land, about staying, I'll support you. And if your feelings if you could ever think of me as more than a friend, well, that would make me the happiest man in Wyoming territory." Tears welled in Tessa's eyes, not tears of grief this time, but of something else entirely. She reached for his hand and squeezed it tightly. Matthew's smile was tender as he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "That's enough for me right now," he murmured. The storm passed, and they returned to town, but something had shifted between them. Martha noticed it immediately when they arrived at the boarding house. "You two are soaked," she exclaimed. "Mr. Ingram, you must stay for dinner. I'll not have you riding all the way back to your ranch in wet clothes." As they sat around Martha's dining table that evening, joined by the boarding house's other residents, Tessa felt a strange sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Matthew sat beside her, occasionally catching her eye with a warm glance that made her heart flutter. Later, as he prepared to leave, they stood alone on the porch. The night was clear after the storm, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. "I'll come by next Saturday," Matthew said, his hat in his hands. "Unless you'd like to ride out to the ranch before then." "Meet my foreman and see the operation." Tessa hesitated, then wrote in her notebook, "I would like that. Thursday it is." He looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her face. "Good night, Tessa." She watched him ride away, his straight-backed figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a flicker of hope for the future. Thursday dawned bright and clear. Tessa wore her riding skirt again, with a fresh white blouse Martha had helped her iron. She was waiting on the porch when Matthew arrived, leading the chestnut mare she'd come to think of as hers, his face lit up at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. The ride to Matthew's ranch took them through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers and across a shallow, pebbly stream. As they crested a hill, Matthew reined in his horse and gestured ahead. "There it is. Ingram Ranch." The spread before them was impressive, a large, well-built main house, several outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse, all situated in a natural bowl of land protected by hills on three sides. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "It's not the biggest operation in the territory," Matthew said, "but it's solid. My father started with just 20 acres and 30 head of cattle. Now we're running over 500 head on 3,000 acres. Pride was evident in his voice, not boastful but honest satisfaction in what he and his family had built. As they rode down toward the ranch, several cowboys looked up from their work, touching their hats in greeting. A lean, weathered man in his 50s approached as they dismounted in front of the main house. "Boss," he nodded to Matthew, then turned curious eyes to Tessa. "Tom, this is Miss Tessa Thompson," Matthew said. "Miss Thompson, my foreman, Tom Caldwell." "Pleasure, miss," Tom said, tipping his hat. "Boss has mentioned you a time or two." Tessa smiled and nodded in greeting. "Tom, would you show Miss Thompson the new foals while I see to a few things?" Matthew asked. "Be happy to. This way, miss." The next hour was spent touring the ranch. Tom showed her the spring foals, explaining the breeding program Matthew had established. They visited the smithy, where a young man was shoeing a horse, and the cookhouse, where an elderly Chinese man named Lai was preparing the midday meal for the ranch hands. Everyone they met greeted Tessa with respect, but she couldn't miss the curious glances, the whispered comments when they thought she was out of earshot. Word had clearly spread that she was special to the ranch owner. When Matthew rejoined them, he dismissed Tom with thanks and took Tessa to see the main house. It was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large stone fireplace dominating the main room. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of Matthew's love of reading. "My mother's influence," he explained, seeing her interest in the books. "She was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure our home had books, even out here." He showed her through the house the kitchen with its large cast iron stove, the dining room with its long table, for when I entertained the neighboring ranchers, and his study, where maps of the ranch lands covered one wall. Upstairs, he pointed out rooms but didn't enter them. Guest rooms mostly empty, and my room at the end of the hall. The tour complete, they returned to the main room, where Matthew gestured for her to sit on the comfortable sofa while he built up the fire against the slight chill of the afternoon. "What do you think?" he asked, settling beside her. "Of the ranch, I mean." Tessa took out her notebook and wrote, "It's wonderful. I can see how much work has gone into it. You should be proud." "I am," he admitted, "but sometimes it feels empty. A house needs a family to truly be a home." The implication hung in the air between them. Tessa's heart raced as she wrote, "Do you want a family?" Matthew read her words and looked up, his blue eyes serious. "I do, very much. The right family with the right woman." Tessa held his gaze, feeling both nervous and strangely exhilarated. Slowly, she wrote, "I think I would like that too." "Someday." A smile spread across Matthew's face, warming his features. "I'm a patient man, Tessa. I can wait for someday." They ate dinner with the ranch hands in the cookhouse, Tessa sitting beside Matthew at the head of the table. The men were respectful but welcoming, including her in their conversation despite her silence, seeming to take their cue from Matthew, who occasionally answered questions on her behalf. As twilight approached, they prepared to ride back to town. Matthew had just helped Tessa mount when hoofbeats sounded rapidly approaching the ranch. A young cowboy rode in hard, his horse lathered. "Mr. Ingram," he called. "Trouble at the north pasture. Rustlers hit the herd." Matthew's expression hardened. "How many?" "At least 20 head taken." "Tim's tracking them, but we need more men." Matthew turned to Tessa, conflict evident in his face. "I have to go." She nodded her understanding. "Tom," Matthew called, and the foreman hurried over. "I need you to escort Miss Thompson back to town." "Of course, boss." Matthew looked up at Tessa. "I'm sorry, I didn't want our day to end this way." She shook her head and reached down to briefly touch his cheek, letting him know she understood. He caught her hand and pressed it firmly. "I'll come to town as soon as this is resolved. Be safe." With that, he strode to the corral, calling for his fastest horse. Tom was a polite escort but not talkative, which suited Tessa fine. When they reached the boarding house, he tipped his hat and wished her good night before turning back toward the ranch. Martha met her at the door with worried eyes. Word spreading about rustlers. "Is Matthew?" Tessa nodded, indicating he was dealing with the situation. "Well, I hope he's careful. Those rustlers can be a dangerous lot." For the next 3 days, Tessa found herself watching the road from town toward Matthew's ranch, anxiety building with each passing hour. On the evening of the 3rd day, just as she was sitting down to dinner with Martha and the other boarders, hoofbeats sounded outside. Martha went to the window. "It's him," she said, relief evident in her voice. Tessa rose from the table, heart pounding, and hurried to the door. Matthew stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking exhausted but unharmed. His clothes were dusty, and he had several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "I apologize for the state I'm in," he said, "but I wanted you to know we're all right. We recovered most of the cattle, and the rustlers are in custody in the next county." The relief that flooded through Tessa was so intense she felt her knees weaken. Without thinking, she stepped forward and threw her arms around his waist, burying her face against his chest. Matthew stiffened in surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her gently. "I'm all right," he murmured into her hair. "Everything's all right now." When she pulled back, she saw Martha watching from the doorway with a knowing smile. The older woman cleared her throat. "You must be hungry, Mr. Ingram. Come in and join us for dinner." "I don't want to impose nonsense. You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in days." Over dinner, Matthew related the story of tracking the rustlers and the confrontation that followed. "No one was seriously hurt, thank God. A few bruises, that's all, and we got back 18 of the 20 stolen cattle." After the meal, Martha tactfully occupied the other boarders in the parlor, allowing Matthew and Tessa a moment alone in the kitchen. "I missed you," Matthew said softly, taking her hand across the table. "These past few days, even in the middle of everything, I kept thinking of you." Tessa squeezed his hand, her eyes conveying what she couldn't say. "I need to get back to the ranch tonight," he said reluctantly. "But I'd like to come into town on Saturday if that's all right." She nodded, not wanting to let go of his hand. "Tessa," he said, his voice lowering, "I know it's soon, and I don't expect an answer now, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are serious. When the time is right, I hope." He paused, gathering his courage. I hope you might consider a future together." Her heart soared at his words. She reached for her notebook and wrote swiftly, "I have feelings for you too, strong feelings." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "That's all I need to know for now." True to his word, Matthew returned on Saturday. He arrived at the boarding house freshly shaven and dressed in his best clothes, bearing a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I thought we might attend the social at the church this evening," he said, "if you feel up to it." Tessa hesitated. She hadn't been to any social function since her father's death, and the thought of facing the entire town, with their curious stares and whispered comments about her silence, was daunting. Seeing her hesitation, Matthew added, "We don't have to stay long, and you don't have to speak to anyone. I'll be right beside you the whole time." His reassurance decided her. She nodded and went upstairs to change into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's favorite color. The church social was already in full swing when they arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters of the community hall, casting a warm glow over the gathered townspeople. Music played from a small group of musicians in the corner, a fiddle, a harmonica, and a banjo, creating lively tunes that had several couples dancing in the cleared center of the room. Conversations paused briefly as Matthew escorted Tessa inside, his hand protectively at the small of her back. Then, with the resilience of frontier people accustomed to minding their own business, the townspeople returned to their activities, though many cast curious glances their way. Martha, already there helping with refreshments, beamed at the sight of them. "Come have some punch," she called, waving them over. As they made their way across the room, several people greeted Matthew, who introduced Tessa with simple courtesy, neither drawing attention to her silence nor apologizing for it. They had just accepted cups of punch when the music changed to a slower tune, a waltz. Matthew looked down at Tessa, a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance?" Dancing required no words. Tessa nodded, setting aside her cup. Matthew led her to the dance floor and took her in his arms with proper decorum, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, a respectable distance between their bodies. As they moved to the music, Tessa felt the curious stares fade away until there was only Matthew, his blue eyes never leaving her face, his strong hand steady at her waist. "You dance beautifully," he murmured. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. They danced through that song and the next, a simple two-step that had them moving around the floor with the other couples. As the evening progressed, Tessa found herself relaxing. Several of Matthew's neighboring ranchers and their wives came to speak with them, treating her with kindness and not pressing when she only nodded or shook her head in response to questions. "She's had a difficult time," she overheard Matthew explaining quietly to one older couple. "Her father's passing hit her hard." "Of course, dear," the woman replied, patting Tessa's arm. "We understand. Take all the time you need." By the time they left the social, well before its conclusion, Tessa felt a tentative connection to the community she hadn't experienced before. As they walked back to the boarding house in the cool night air, Matthew kept her hand tucked in the crook of his arm. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," he said. "I know it wasn't easy." On the boarding house porch, lit only by the silver of the moon and the warm glow from inside, they paused. Matthew turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Tessa," he began, his voice tender, "I know we've only known each other a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day at the cemetery when I saw you kneeling there, so broken and yet so strong." Tears filled Tessa's eyes as she looked up at him, her heart overflowing. "You don't have to answer now," he continued. "I know you're still healing, but when you're ready, if you ever feel you could love me too, I want to build a life with you. On your father's land or my ranch or somewhere new entirely. Wherever you want to be, that's where I want to be too." A single tear spilled down Tessa's cheek. Matthew reached up to gently wipe it away with his thumb. "I didn't mean to make you cry," he said softly. Tessa shook her head, trying to convey that these weren't tears of sadness. She wished desperately that she could speak, that she could tell him what was in her heart. Impulsively, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a brief, tender kiss. When she pulled back, Matthew looked stunned, then a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. "Can I take that as a good sign?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded, smiling through her tears. Matthew drew her into his arms, holding her close, his cheek resting against her hair. "Take all the time you need," he whispered. "I'll be here." Over the following weeks, Tessa and Matthew fell into a pattern. He would come to town on Wednesdays and Saturdays, taking her riding or walking, sometimes just sitting with her on the boarding house porch. They attended church together on Sundays, and occasionally joined community gatherings throughout it all. Matthew never pressured her to speak, accepting her written notes and expressive eyes as enough. The townsfolk, following his lead, gradually stopped waiting for her to talk and simply accepted her as she was. As August turned to September, Tessa began spending more time on her father's land. Matthew had built a small cabin there, a temporary structure to use while overseeing the cattle he was grazing on the property. "Eventually, we could build something more substantial," he told her as they sat on the cabin's porch one afternoon, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "A proper house, like the one your father planned." Tessa nodded, picturing it a home on this beautiful land, perhaps with children someday. A future she hadn't dared imagine in those dark days after her father's death. Martha, observing their growing closeness with approval, took Tessa aside one evening. "He's a good man, child, the best kind. Don't let your grief keep you from happiness. Your father would want you to live fully." Tessa knew she was right. Her father had always encouraged her to embrace life, to be brave. It was time to try, at least. The following Saturday, Matthew took her on a picnic by the creek on her father's land. As they sat beneath the cottonwoods, he spoke of his plans for expanding the cattle operation, of improvements he wanted to make to his ranch house. "The east wing could use renovating," he said. "It gets the morning light, would make a fine set of rooms for a lady of the house. And the garden out back, my mother had roses there once. They've gone wild, but they could be tamed again, with the right touch." Tessa listened, understanding what he wasn't quite saying directly, that he was imagining her in that house as his wife. As they packed up their picnic, Matthew suddenly grew serious. "Tessa, I've been patient and I'll continue to be if that's what you need, but I want you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger." He took her hands in his. "I love you. I want to marry you when you're ready, if you'll have me." Tessa's heart swelled with emotion. For weeks, she'd been fighting against the walls of silence that grief had built around her, struggling to find her voice again. Now, looking into Matthew's honest blue eyes, feeling the gentle strength of his hands holding hers, something broke free inside her. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. His eyes widened in shock. "Matthew," she said again, a little stronger this time. "Yes." "Tessa," he breathed, his face transforming with wonder and joy. "You spoke." "Yes," she repeated, tears filling her eyes. "And yes, I'll marry you. I love you too." With a sound that was half laugh, half sob, Matthew pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. When he set her down, he cradled her face in his hands as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Say it again," he whispered. "My name, Matthew," she said, smiling through her tears. "Matthew Ingram, I love you." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I've been waiting to hear your voice for so long," he murmured. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined." That evening, when they returned to the boarding house, Martha took one look at their glowing faces and knew. "Well," she demanded, hands on her hips. "We're getting married," Matthew announced, his arm around Tessa's waist. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my dears, that's wonderful news." And Martha, Tessa said softly. Thank you for everything. The older woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Child, you're speaking. Yes, Tessa smiled. It seems I just needed the right words to say. Matthew and Tessa were married in the Clearwater Creek Church on a bright October morning, with fall colors painting the surrounding hills in russet and gold. The entire community turned out for the celebration, genuinely happy for the quiet girl who had found her voice and the respected rancher who had waited patiently for her to speak his name. After the ceremony, they rode to Matthew's ranch, now their ranch, where the hands had decorated the main house with autumn flowers and ribbons. As Matthew carried her across the threshold, Tessa felt the last shadows of grief lifting from her heart, replaced by the warm certainty of love and belonging. That night, as they lay in each other's arms in what was now their bedroom, Tessa traced Matthew's face in the moonlight that spilled through the window. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "For sitting with me when I couldn't speak, for loving me through the silence." Matthew gathered her closer. "I would have waited forever to hear you say my name." "Matthew," she said softly, savoring the sound. "My Matthew." "Always," he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that spoke of all the days and nights to come, of a future built together on Wyoming's wild and beautiful frontier.